My name's AJ Withers, and I'm a queer, disabled community organizer in Toronto around anti-poverty and disability issues. And I have a book coming out in January called Disability, Politics and Theory from Fernwood Press.
Hi, my name is Karen. I'm a member of Common Cause, and I'm also a health professional in a community health center. I also had before a disability, a temporary disability, and I also have a sister that has a permanent disability, that is living currently with a disability. So this is why I wanted to be part of this interviews.
My name is Brian. I'm with Common Cause in Toronto.
My name's Anne. I'm a member of Common Cause. I also work with people with developmental disabilities, and I'm like somewhat of a crazy person.
Disability is a social construct, and depending on the culture, the time, or the context that one is in will determine whether or not disability is marked on that person. So in some places and times and cultures, something that's considered disability isn't considered disability in other times, places, or cultures. And fundamentally, disabled people are constructed as people who are considered abnormal or unwanted or unfit within a given economy or social system. The medical model of disability is the mainstream way that people understand disability as a pathology or a sickness, and it seeks out pathologies or abnormalities and works to find them and fix them or cure them, and failing that, accommodate them.
So the social model of disability is a model of understanding disability which presents a separation between impairment, so the physical or mental characteristics that a person has that may be different from what other people typically have, and disability or disablement, so the social process that oppresses people with disabilities through different institutions in our society, such as work, schools, the state. So the social model of disability, what I find important to remember, locates the problem of disability, the challenges in the society rather than in the individual, and looks to address those through social action rather than through changing individuals with disabilities.
Radical disability politics is a shift from the mainstream way of thinking about disability. The mainstream way is a medical model. The disability studies canon is a way that incorporates an understanding of oppression while still adopting some of the medical model. And a radical disability analysis is a complete rejection of the medical model as something that has been implemented in order to maintain power and control for people with privilege in society, and fundamentally questioning that and recognizing disability as entirely a social construct. The idea of what's normal, that disability is constructed as being abnormal, was brought into the English language around the 1850s, around the time of eugenics. And that idea that many times we think of as being always there was fundamentally rooted in the creation of an industrial revolution, changing capitalism to the capitalism that we know now, and constructing workers as normal bodies that could function within factories. And so all of the people that couldn't function within factories became abnormal or disabled. And up till the Industrial Revolution, things like intellectual disabilities and oftentimes physical disabilities weren't thought of as disabilities at all. They were just thought of as human variants. The description of disability and the marginalization of disabled people is really fundamental to the success of capitalism, both in marginalizing people that aren't participating in the capitalist system the way that the system requires people to participate, but also in the way that disabled people, non-disabled people are given a threat. So disabled people are oftentimes forced to live in poverty, marginalized, experience any number of different kinds of segregation, and that's a threat to people that aren't seen as disabled to be productive and to work in the capitalist system, and if they don't, that there are these consequences, and disabled lives are the manifestation of that kind of consequence.
For me, the kind of the ways that work or labor interact with disability or ability. In thinking about it more, I kind of I'm starting to appreciate more and more how important it actually is for me. And I also see the importance of people that I work with and people that I have worked with all throughout my life, like conceiving of themselves as able-bodied, while also terrified of or recognizing the lie of that. I think it's a rarity for me to have actually like shared a workplace with anybody that I would in kind of like full consideration consider an able-bodied person. But it's centrally important that they consider themselves able-bodied, and we always have, no matter how absurd that actually is. It's a really substantial disciplining mechanism that's almost bred in the bone of almost every single working class person I know, and that's chasing after being the strongest, most productive worker, not just for the sake of your boss, but almost for your sake as well. So I think it's fundamentally important that we understand the associations that capital has, or the importance that capital puts on our bodies. And it's important that we understand the ways in which we've been hoodwinked into agreeing with that.
For me, through what I do for a job, working with people who have a label of having developmental or intellectual disabilities, I've seen how, first of all, like many of the situations they're put in terms of work can be extremely exploitative, like working for much less than minimum wage in environments like what used to be called sheltered workshops, where they do sort of fairly like menial repetitive tasks for like an extremely low wage. Sort of the pressure in a way that is put on people to work in order to sort of, that's what makes your life meaningful as like a functioning adult, is that you should be working.
The ways in which disablement or being disabled interacts with that, I think is kind of isn't quite as descriptive as what it means to be able-bodied as opposed to disabled, and like every minute of the working day and even afterwards, like myself and almost every single person I've ever worked with is in this battle to assert that they're actually physically capable of doing things that the only reason that they're doing them and the kind of the degree to which they're pushing themselves is because it's their job. We conceive of ourselves as completely competent, independent, able-bodied people, and really nothing could be further from the truth.
The Canadian state is intertwined with capitalism, but also I think that one of the things that disability politics can bring is like an understanding of people as individuals and negotiating different people's needs, and that can help work to undermine the state and the state's power, and really looking at what people need and how we can provide community support and build community strength is a really important contribution that radical disability politics can make to anarchism and to the way that we understand the state.
So I think the state plays like many roles in like and has like a fair bit of influence in like the lives of many like disabled people. The state often makes decisions about who is disabled or not disabled, who's eligible for different income support programs. The state also in Canada administers like medical and like social services that can impact on the lives of disabled people. Like for example, in the past, like large institutions. I think when you're talking about the state and disability, like something you have to talk about is eugenics. So that you can look at the idea of like the body politic, right, and how the state is in some ways invested in having like a healthy or a fit population. And in the past we've seen the state impose eugenic policies on people with disabilities, for example, like forced sterilization of people with disabilities in Alberta and BC.
For me, I've done a lot of research into anarcho-primitivism. I've also done a lot of research into historically the eugenic movement and the role that anarchists played there. And some anarchists were very against eugenics, like Kropotkin, but other anarchists were eugenicists and actively called for the sterilization of disabled people or the unfit. And I think that that's something that is important for disabled people to recognize has been the case in all movements, and there have been elements of that throughout history, and that doesn't necessarily reflect all anarchism. And I think that people can make that distinction, but I think that it's really important that people are accountable to anarchists are accountable to the eugenic past and the eugenic present through anarcho-primitivism, and actively challenge it and actively work against it in order to show the solidarity that disabled people, I think, need to see in order for there to be more trust in building more collective movement.
It's just one component. Their ableism is just one component of like a holistically misanthropic social outlook. Almost more misanthropic, almost more anti-person or like not just anti-worker, but like anti-person, almost as misanthropic as capitalism, or potentially even more so.
There's a number of different ways that people view primitivism, but fundamentally, in order to have this utopic view for certain people, oftentimes very privileged people, disabled people have to die. And that is very sad, and it's not okay. And I think it's important for all anarchists, because primitivism is so linked to anarchism and claims to be a part of anarchism, that anarchists challenge that and confront that and work to express that that is not their view, and to ensure that disabled people are included and valued. There's lots of different kinds of anarchism, and for me, any kind of good, politically sound form of anarchism has a strong anti-oppression analysis, and disability is a really key component of that.
Because of the first principle, one of the first principles of anarchism is everyone gives what they can and they take what they need. So that's exactly what people with disability need, so they can participate fully in their own capability in the society, and also take what they need, the needs, the support they need. They can take it from the society. So.
As someone that believes in radical disability politics and anarchism, I think that they both, like for me, they're inseparable.
My understanding of mutual aid isn't so much that it's an aspiration that anarchists have, but it's actually a recognition that it's one of the primary elements of our world, right? And it goes unrecognized. That there is an interdependentness.
And I think that mutual aid and the fact, if we focus more on the fact that everything that we do is collective, it offers a lot more possibilities for a society in which people who may have differing abilities, differing needs, can be respected as equal members of that society, and the contributions they can make and they do make are respected, and that it's seen that all of our like successes or failures and the various things that we try are based on everyone's work and not just you as an individual, which I think is ultimately positive for all people, but especially those people who are in the society considered disabled.
And oftentimes in disability communities that manifests in care collectives and people coming together to help folks, you know, go pee or make dinner or shop or whatever it is, but the acknowledgement that that's a reciprocal relationship, that the disabled person gets some things from it, but the non-disabled person or the person with different needs gets things from it as well, and that both of those roles are really meaningful and important. But mutual aid and the spirit of collectivity and acknowledging that interdependence, I think, are super important, and beyond like, you know, a do-it-yourself culture, like creating a do-it-together culture. Well, disabled people have been engaged in direct action for decades upon decades and have participated in a lot of different really creative actions that have been accessible to lots of different people. And I think that we can bring that creativity to all different kinds of organizing around direct action, and even just like case actions where disabled people have oftentimes fought disability or welfare to get what they need, but also disabled people oftentimes, instead of having our bodies treated as burdens or hazards, use our bodies in ways that are really powerful in direct action. And I think that a lot of times people fall into boxes of what direct action means and what it looks like, and broadening that box and making sure that it's inclusive and accessible to people is really important. And in doing that, oftentimes actions can be stronger and more powerful.
We often exclude people with disability in our movements or during our events. I think we often don't think about their issues, but it's part of everybody's issue, because everybody at one point will be disabled, either temporarily or permanently. So it's something that affects everybody. Every single person will be affected with disability issues.
In terms of the way that people organize, oftentimes radicals will view people's worth in a movement with how much they produce and how productive they are, and that is just like an adoption of a capitalist value that's really unfortunate and problematic, and shifting that to value people for any number of ways that they participate in the community beyond what's viewed as production is really important, and is something that I think a lot of anarchists really struggle with.
So collective responsibility is sort of a concept that is present in anarchism that describes how it sort of puts into practice, I think, our focus on the social over the individual. So not only am I responsible for the things that I do individually, but also the things that happen around me. Just to give like a quick practical example, it's like if I'm in a political organization and I didn't promise to make the poster but someone else did, but I never took the time to ask them, you know, if they needed help, it is, if the poster doesn't get made, it is also my responsibility as well as theirs, right? Even though, so it's focusing on the social, sort of like taking precedence over the individual. How I think that relates to disability that's important is that I think it could also relate to issues around accessibility, so that we would all have a collective responsibility to make the spaces that we work in politically accessible to as many people as possible. I think what we should be trying for is to create spaces where we are responsible for what we do, but where there's also support available, and where there's also a culture where it's okay to ask for that support when needed. I think that in terms of mutual aid and collective responsibility, that it shouldn't be so much about, oh, okay, well, we have to provide this accommodation for this person, and we have to make sure that there's a ramp for this person, and that kind of thing, as much as like building sort of like a broader culture of solidarity where we all take responsibility for ensuring that the space allows for as much as possible the full participation of anyone who would want to participate.
One of the ways that anarchist organizations can structure themselves is implementing a culture within the organization that automatically looks at accessibility and interdependence and ways of talking about meeting people's needs and ensuring that people can get in the door and can have meaningful participation in an organization, but also ensuring that organizations put forward demands that are inclusive of disability issues and are not tokenistic, but come from disabled people and from disabled communities around what we actually need and are fighting for.
Like, as a member of Common Cause, with mostly just one other person in Common Cause, like, I started looking at some of this stuff and trying to bring it to other people in the organization who maybe weren't as familiar with it or hadn't really had much interest in it, I think, is that sometimes I think there's like a lack. I think people maybe had certain preconceptions about what radical disability politics were about. One of them maybe being that they're for certain people, that it's for disabled people. And I think what a lot of people maybe realize, because we've seen sort of more interest in it, is that it affects the things we're talking about in terms of being either disabled by society, by work, by school, are things that a lot of people have experienced. But if you're not experiencing that, then what you're experiencing is almost like a process of being like abled, right? Like you're experiencing the other side of that, and that can also bring a lot of tensions, right? Like you can kind of feel like even if you're having like a really hard time, like physically or emotionally, like you don't want to let people know at your work because you're going to sort of fall into this other category of person. So I think what is important for anarchists to realize, and I think what's kind of come out from some of the discussions I've had with other Common Cause members, is that these questions of like who is excluded and included in different spaces, and sort of like how we support each other and how we place value on different activities, I think is something that affects all people, and that like these politics are essential for understanding like how we analyze the world and the kind of changes that we would want.
Not having an analysis that we don't want to be a reformist, like that disability movement shouldn't be reformist movements. They should be revolutionary movements. So like although like we wanna try to make people's life better, like on a day-to-day, like for example the Raise the Rates campaign on increasing the Ontario Work or ODSP, so increasing the support programs, the money support program at 40 up to 40% will make their lives better. So we want to fight for those things too, but we want to have an analysis of like a revolutionary, like the end of capitalism in the state, not just trying to reform what the state is doing right now.
So there's a lot of different things that anarchist organizations can do, and there's really practical things, and there's kind of oftentimes messier and harder institutional things that can happen. So there's an infinite number of issues that cross over, and like I said before, I'm an anarchist and do radical disability work, and for me there's not a crossover, they're completely integrated, but even for people that there's like basic issues around poverty and segregation and like the forced incarceration of many people who are labeled as disabled, the way that capitalism plays out in disabled people's lives.
The different components that make up capitalism, it's not just about how can anarchists engage in mass movements particularly structured around disability theory or mass struggles of disabled people, although that is stuff that has to be fought out, like in our cities, like in our workplaces. Issues of accessibility, casualization of employment, or just like chronic unemployment. It's not just about how can anarchists participate in mass movements structured around disability, but how can a more thorough understanding of the importance of disability be incorporated within all the mass struggles that we have.
I think another thing that we can do is that, so then when we start to get these ideas, even if it's just very like basic new ideas, to start to bring that to some of our mass work is trying to sort of link up different issues. Like a very basic example was in like a mass organization that a number of us in Common Cause are part of, there was a campaign that was posed for free transit. And one of our members made an amendment to that to make it a campaign around free and accessible transit. So just this like, and this isn't someone who had any particular knowledge of disability who would consider themselves disabled, anything like that. But from that, like it's become a part of the campaign where different disability groups are involved in that, and it's something that there have been actions around accessibility. And this isn't something Common Cause has done, but it's something that's kind of that we were able to sort of introduce that. I think to, even if we're not focusing on struggles that are specific to disability, to try to see how we can bring that in. So if members are involved in anti-prison struggles, how can we bring in analysis around other institutions that exist that are disability focused? What's the relationship between psychiatric institutions and prisons? I think trying to sort of make those links and to connect those struggles is a role that we can have, because we tend to have members involved in a lot of different groups.
There's a bunch of different ways that people can work with different organizations like neighborhood communities and unions and student groups. One of the ways is articulating disability politics in a way that makes sense to those organizations. So sometimes the conversation that you have with different groups is going to be slightly different, but around union organizing, talking about injured workers and talking about capitalism and oppression and the exclusion of disabled people and the impact that has on workers across the board. With respect to neighborhood organizations, there's every neighborhood has disabled people in it, and that are a really vibrant, important part of every community. And so working to help people understand that and recognize the places where that is, and working with people to help build bridges and incorporate disabled people and disability issues into that community.
I don't think it's utopic to propose an abolition of social stratification, and in that disability is predominantly and like there's a difference between the conditions under which a human body finds itself or is put in, and whether or not they're conceived of as disabled or able-bodied. Like that is like you were saying, that is a social construction. And it's not utopic to work towards the abolition of that social construction.
I think it's also important to keep in mind that like many, if thinking about the future and about like how a lot of the current social processes of disablement would be unnecessary and in a lot of ways like unhelpful, right? Like the need to create like the separation between deserving and undeserving poor and to legitimize things in that way. Like without that, the need to sort of label people as disabled, like how that is helpful kind of goes away. I would never think that in the future, if we lived without capitalism, that like what I have that could be described as mental illness would go away. But I would like to live in a world where like I wouldn't have to worry about like seeking, if I needed help, seeking it because of an employer finding out because of the box you check on the form when you apply for jobs or something like that. That like that aspect of it that just makes things harder would, like I don't think it's utopic to talk about that going away.